again, everyone. This is your host, Mike Hingson, and welcome to another edition of Unstoppable Mindset, where inclusion, diversity, and the unexpected meet. That unexpected is always so much fun. But anyway, we're really glad you're here with us. We appreciate it. Today, we are going to have the opportunity to chat with Cris Edwards. And Cris, among other things, has formed a nonprofit called So Quiet. And I think there's a fascinating story behind that. And basically, he deals with a lot of people who happen to have something called misophonia, which I'm not overly familiar with, and I'll bet most of you aren't. But Cris clearly, because he founded So Quiet, is an expert. And so there you are, Cris. Now you're stuck with it. Well, I want to welcome you. Yeah, there you go, Cris. Cris is in St. Louis, Missouri. We're out here in California, so we're a little ways apart, but isn't science a wonderful thing? But Cris, I want to welcome you to Unstoppable Mindset. I really appreciate you being here, and we're looking forward to having a great chat.
Thank you so much, Michael. It's a pleasure to be here.
I met Cris through Sheldon Lewis at accessiBe. Now, you all have heard of Sheldon before. He's a nonprofit partner manager at accessiBe and works with a lot of organizations like Chris's, and he's said, Cris, you ought to go on this here podcast. And Cris, I guess, decided that we were probably worth going on. So here we are. Well, why don't we start, Cris? Why don't you tell us a little bit about kind of the early Cris growing up and some of that stuff?
Absolutely. Thank you. Well, I just turned 50 last week. So I don't feel like I'm 50, but I was born in 1974. I grew up in San Antonio, Texas. And, a lot of times we can connect dots looking backwards, but at the time in the 70s and the 80s, there really wasn't as much awareness and cognizance and attention paid to things like neurodiversity and invisible disabilities and different disorders and things. There was a whole different social viewpoint to that. But growing up, I always had noticed a few things. I felt a little different from other people. But I did well as far as the classes. I was capable of doing everything quite well, but was always distracted and oftentimes found myself responding to things in a way that was different than the way other people responded to the sensory input around them. So we'll get more into how I realized that is a thing later, but managed to go through school. What's that?
Is that sort of like ADHD?
Well, that's a good point. I actually do have ADHD, but that is a separate disorder from misophonia. Yeah. What's interesting, thank you for asking that. Misophonia often co-occurs with other conditions like that, other mental health conditions like ADHD, OCD. There's not one of those that sticks out. Misophonia is considered a separate, unique condition, disorder. It can occur on its own, but we know through research that it commonly co-occurs with other things. So as I got older, what's that?
I say anyway, go ahead.
Anyway, yeah. So I actually, I got through school. I actually ended up going to college and went to grad school. I studied theater and got a master's of fine arts in directing. But
where'd you go?
Well, for undergraduate school, I went to a little university called Tarleton State University. It's about an hour west of Fort Worth, Texas. It's actually an agricultural college that happened to have a theater department. That was pretty good. And then I went to Texas Tech out in the desert of Lubbock for grad school. But I had always, early on, I can remember as far back as fourth grade or maybe even earlier than that. Nobody has any record of this. We're just going off of my flawed memory. I remember that the sensory input I got around me, I felt like I responded to differently than other people. For example, if I was in a class, I can remember trying to listen to a teacher teach or trying to take a test. And if there were particular things going on in the classroom, I could not focus on the lesson and I could not focus on the test or whatever, because I was so distracted, by particular motions or particular sounds. And I learned later on, much later in my adult life, that they had created a term for this. It wasn't just that I was particular about sounds, that it's an actual disorder called misophonia. And so when I found out the word, probably around 2007, I found out that this particular term was created in 2001. So nobody had any concept of this existence while I was in school. But in general, misophonia is a largely auditory, but in fact, multisensory aversion disorder. Um, if you ever hear of somebody who uh, says something like, I can't, if you don't stop smacking your chewing gum, I'm going to have to leave. It makes me anxious and frustrated more than is normal. Nobody likes the
Mm,
sound of smacking gum, but if it gets to a point where you literally cannot be around that sound and it gives you this very accentuated irritation, frustration, like a need to just get away from that sound in a way that isn't normal.
yeah.
That's kind of a hallmark of misophonia. Um, Misophonia can also have a visual element. So seeing somebody doing something like if I see somebody chewing gum but I can't hear them, that actually brings about that same reaction. And
The same reaction. Yeah.
it's not a voluntary reaction. Um, there's also a similar kind of sibling disorder called misokinesia, and it is when people have a similar response, again, an involuntary physiological response to visual motions. So if I was in class looking back and somebody was shaking their feet or twirling their hair, which are very normal things for people to do when they're anxious taking a test, I couldn't concentrate. That
Mm,
motion just, my brain focuses on that motion immediately, and I literally cannot focus on anything else, and it makes me very upset. So that's kind of a um, misophonia in a nutshell. You know, I if I was in a class and somebody had a bag of chips, the crinkling plastic and the sound
mm,
of somebody eating
yeah.
chips would affect me in a way that is very abnormal.
Yeah.
So that was misophonia, and when I found out that this word existed, it explained a lot of the issues that I had growing up. I know that those my inability to participate fully in classes affected my grades and so forth. And so since then, kind of during the pandemic when everything was shut down, um, I had been working in the theater industry here in St. Louis, and there was no theater happening for a couple of years. We didn't know for how long, so I decided to do something that was different. And I started this organization to help people understand this really difficult to understand sensory disorder. And there's been a lot of research happening on it. We know that it's actually very prevalent in society. There's been a number of prevalence studies that show that misophonia is actually quite common. As many as 1 in 5 people have the symptoms, and roughly about 5% of the population has it to a degree to where it impacts their life from a moderate to severe amount. And so it can be disabling. I've worked with people who isolate themselves, and there's sounds and visual things in the world that they try to avoid, and we end up avoiding things as a way of coping. It becomes very isolating.
Right.
So we've worked with people who, even though they live in the same house as a parent that maybe is activates that for them, they don't talk to their family because it's so uncomfortable. The sound of a person's voice or the way that they move is so uncomfortable that they stay in their room and just text their family that's in the same house. It can be very isolating and frustrating. So I kind of went on a bunch of different tangents there answering your question, but hopefully that makes some sense, and I'm happy to explain any of it more.
So what did you do as you were growing up and so on to deal with it? I mean, you obviously did something that allowed you to be successful at going to school, whether your
Mhm.
grades were affected or not. You still did make it through and all that. What did you do to deal with all of it? Because
That's a
you
great
didn't have a lot
question.
of understanding yet of what it really was to have misophonia.
Fantastic question. Yeah. Looking back, there were things that I would try to do, but I didn't have the awareness and I didn't have the words to explain to other people what I was dealing with. Because if I just tell people, if they don't know what it is,
Yeah.
I can't, the sound of the crinkling chip bag is driving me so crazy. It sounds crazy before we knew what it was, but a lot of it was just suffering in silence. I know it affected my mental health. It's sort of like I could try to compare it to if you're having an anxiety attack or even a panic attack, but you try to hide it, and that an anxiety attack or something is not something you can control. They just come on sometimes. And if you were to try to hide that and quell it so that people don't notice what you're going through, that's a little like what it's like to sort of suffer in silence and act like
Right.
everything is normal when internally I'm just like wanting to leave the situation because it's such an uncomfortable feeling being around totally normal sounds that are not a threat in any way.
So you kind of just did suffer in silence, and
Yeah,
I guess the best thing to say is coped, if you will.
coped. And I would do things improvisationally to try to help. Looking back, I probably could have, if I'd thought about it, carried foam earplugs with me, which I do now, and worn those in class to kind of filter out some sounds. But uh, I was talking to some other people recently who have misophonia in one of our peer support groups, and I would do little things like I would try to, if you could rest your elbows on your school desk and put your hand, put your chin in the palm of your hands
Yeah.
together. You can kind of secretly put your fingers in your ears in that pose, but look like you're still paying attention.
Yeah.
So I would do things like that to where it looks like I'm still participating, but I'm actually blocking out some of the sound by secretly putting my fingers in my ears to get through the class, and just little things like that I would do to try to get by.
Well,
But
as
yeah,
you matured and got older and so on, did any of the symptoms mitigate or go away, or is it still as prevalent for you as it ever was?
that's a great question. My own experience has been a little bit of both. We don't have any research. We just have anecdotal stories on whether misophonia gets better with age or gets worse with age or not any different. And people will tell you different things. I think mine's been a little bit of both in that there were things that didn't that used to not activate that misophonic reaction, that anxiety and frustration and panic that it brings about, that do now. So, for one example, is not everybody it has that misophonic reaction activated by pet sounds.
Hmm.
Um, and that was never a problem for me until maybe about 10 years ago, where some noises that animals make would bring about that reaction. For example, we were talking about our cats right before we started recording today, and one of my cats is what I call a loud bather. When she's bathing
Hmm.
herself, that very accentuated licking sound causes that involuntary reaction. So I have to kind of put her in the other room, and she doesn't understand it. But so that's something that I have acquired. I've actually acquired new. We call them triggers. I try to avoid calling them triggers because I think that term is kind of overused, so it
Yeah.
doesn't even have any meaning anymore. Um, but at the same time, with age and with introspection, I've learned coping skills. I've learned to deal with this. It is a part of my life, just like anybody with any kind of disability does their best to accept some of the things that are going to be more difficult or different for us, and work on coping with the things that we can and changing the things we can through advocacy or accommodations or whatever. And so, in a way, I've gotten better at dealing with it. I can communicate about it very much more effectively now that I know the term for this thing. And you can Google it, and there is a definition, and there is research on it, which didn't exist at all when I was a child. So I've gotten better at coping with it, even though I think my actual experience of it maybe has gotten a little bit worse. So who knows?
Yeah. It's something that only time is going to really give you the opportunity to determine
Exactly.
how it goes and so on. But what did you do after college? So what did college lead you to?
Well, that's a great question. I was always active in the theater, but the theater industry is kind of difficult. It's a lot of uh, with a normal job, typically you have some job security. So maybe you work there and you know that next month you'll still have your job unless things go wrong. In theater, a lot of times you're hired on by production. So you might work for a month or two on a particular production of a particular play, and then when that's done,
Then you're
you're back to
done.
looking for work again. And so uh, for job security, I sort of went after grad school into the tech industry, and so I worked for a number of small tech startups in the early 2000s. I worked at Apple for a while and did kind of a mishmash of things that um, had some benefits and some job security that the theater world didn't have. And I worked in the theater more as kind of a after school extracurricular kind of capacity. So um, yeah, looking back, I did that, but it was still a struggle. I didn't know the word for this thing, and I knew that either other people were much better at dealing with being bothered by these sounds, or other people were not as bothered by sounds and visual stimuli as I was. And so the 20 years ago, the idea of an open office was a big thing in startups. You have just a big open office where
Yeah,
everybody works. And that is a nightmare for people with misophonia and
I'll bet.
misokinesia. And so I just struggled. It was just suffering in silence, like I said, doing my best to block out sounds when I needed, or put up visual barriers in the offices I worked in to block out visual movements that might be very distracting and uncomfortable. But I probably around 2007, I found out that there's a word for this thing, and slowly over the years, I realized that it's not just a made up term that somebody on the internet came up with. It's an actual medical term that was invented by audiologists, and there was research beginning on it roughly 10 years ago. So yeah, when I look back, I just kind of had a mishmash of things that I have done professionally since then, and I started this organization because I wanted people to know that they can ask for accommodations, that they can talk about this with the confidence that it is a real thing, that it is supported by science, and um, there are ways of getting through life with it. There's actually an entire department at Duke University dedicated to studying misophonia. It's the Duke Center for Misophonia and Emotion Regulation. So all those kind of things help validate that this is a just a strange sensory based disorder. Um, Not to get too long-winded about it, at the beginning I had mentioned that we can oftentimes connect the dots looking backwards. And I'm pretty open about sort of my experiences with things, just because I want other people to realize that uh, they're not alone, and that there are certain pitfalls that can happen, and it's not unusual. So when I look back, in my college years, I found that, as a lot of college students do, alcohol was something that helped me be more social with
Mm.
misophonia and my ADD, and I'm kind of an introvert anyway, even though I can play an extrovert on TV. I was kind of a hermit in college, and theater is a very social
Right.
industry, and so people bugged me a lot about it, and I found that alcohol helped calm my senses so that I could be around other people and be in misophonically triggering situations, which I didn't know about at the time, and be more social. And so over the years, the alcohol became a crutch, and it became a much bigger problem than my misophonia was. And I didn't realize it at the time. So that sort of took over my life. And I got sober about 7 years ago, and really had to assess how I can get by in life with my sensory um, issues and needs without numbing my senses and causing a lot of problems in my life that caused. So I say that just so people know, because I hear other people who sort of self-medicate. It's a understandable thing to do, but it really had a huge impact on my life. And um, I think there are better ways of dealing with invisible conditions than self-medicating. So I just want people to know that that is also a part of my story that happened over the years, and I don't think it's unusual.
Well, tell me a little bit more about, well, about all of that in terms of dealing with it and so on, and what you've evolved into doing.
It's a great question. So I guess since getting sober is a lot of things have happened.
Yeah.
Um, the pandemic happened, and you know, I think I've thrived. Um, a lot of people find it interesting to know that, for example, I got married, and I know that's not really a big deal. It's a very common thing that a lot of people do, but it's important for.
A big deal for you.
Well, it's a big deal for me, sure, but when we work with parents who have children with misophonia and other conditions, they really worry about their children. Like, what kind of future
Hmm.
will they have? You know, are they going to struggle with finding employment and finding friends and being in relationships and doing typical things? And so when they find out, not that I was trying to be encouraging or anything, but when they find out that I actually did get through grad school and got a master's degree, and I have gotten married with this misophonia, they're relieved to hear that it's possible to do fairly typical things. It may not be as easy. So yeah, that's kind of what I've done since getting sober. I finally got married at the age of 45. We moved to St. Louis, where my wife has a very good job in the library system, and started a very successful nonprofit and have remained very active in the recovery community. All of these things are things that I've worked hard to do, and I wouldn't have been able to do if I was still sort of stuck in my self pity, self misery, self medicating phase of my life. I'm glad that's over with. But yeah, I feel like I'm playing catch up on life the last few years.
But on the other hand, you're doing that, and part of it
Right.
is that you've discovered a lot about you, and yeah, you had alcohol and so on, but you've gotten over that, and you've made some mental commitments that certainly have to be helping um,
Hmm.
with you being able to address the issue of misophonia.
Yeah, that's true. Um, I would think that pretty much anybody who has any kind of disorder or condition or disease that impacts your life, especially if it's disabling in any way, or affects your ability to do typical things in a typical way that your average person would. You really have to do a lot of introspection. You have to be really creative with coping in life and coming up with unique solutions to get by, and that requires a certain amount of resourcefulness and introspection and intelligence. And so, I've been very fortunate um, to meet some wonderful people with misophonia through the misophonia community that is actually huge. People are finding out that they are a part of it and they didn't even know it every day, and they're contacting us, and just wonderful people who are bright and talented. And I'm glad to be a part of this unique community that we find ourselves in. I think it's a big part of it too, just the validation that we get and the ability to share our experiences and our frustrations and successes and stuff.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and introspection is very important. Not nearly enough do we use it, and do we teach children
Hmm.
and each other to use the whole concept of introspection to deal with things. I wrote a book, it was published in August of 2024, called Live Like a Guide Dog: True
Hmm.
Stories from a Blind Man and His Dogs About Being Brave, Overcoming Adversity, and Walking in Faith. And one of the main things that we talk about right from the beginning of the book, it's the book is all about helping people learn to control fear rather than letting fear blind you or overwhelm you when something unexpected happens. And as you may know about my story, having been in the World Trade Center and confronted by the horrific things that happened on September 11th, I
Mm.
didn't negatively react because I knew what to do. I had developed, although I didn't realize it at the time, a mindset because I had focused on learning what to do in the case of an emergency. I knew what the evacuation procedures were, I knew why they were what they were, and where to go and the various options and so on. So I was prepared, although never expected to have to use it. But a lot of that also came from thinking about myself and how I would react in different situations, and not becoming paranoid over it, but rather really stopping and thinking at night when I had time, well, how would you react if this happened in this way? Or how would you react? Or what will you do with all the knowledge that you've gained? And I developed a mindset that said, you know what to do in the case of an emergency. And when the emergency occurred, the mindset kicked in. And again, a lot of that has to do with introspection. I think we don't spend nearly enough time in our own minds thinking about ourselves and dealing with the things that we face. One of the lessons that I've been teaching people for a while, and it comes out of the World Trade Center, is don't worry about what you can't control, focus on what you can, and the rest will take care of itself. And there's so much that we worry about that we don't have any control over, but we still worry about it. And all that does is engender more fear in our lives, and makes us more uncomfortable. Whereas if we would just worry about the things that we truly can worry about and not worry about the rest of it, which we can learn to do, we're much better for it. And in your case, it's the same sort of thing. You've got misophonia, okay, but at the same time, um, look at what you've done and how far you've come in terms of just mentally developing and preparing yourself because of the whole issue with alcohol and everything else.
Yeah,
And you have grown, and that has to help in how you deal with misophonia.
absolutely. You said it exceptionally well. And, um, anecdotally, sometimes people say that when you develop, substance use problem of any kind, you kind of stop growing spiritually and growing emotionally. And I think that was true for me. So when I got sober around the age of 42, I had to catch up with being an adult. And one of those was introspection. Like you said, it's a lifelong thing. And I think Aristotle or one of those said that the self-examined life is its own reward.
Mm-hmm.
And through recovery programs, I'm very active in AA, and they focus on why you do the things you do. What is your thinking problem that turned into a drinking problem? And that's just pure introspection, like you said. And I'm grateful to have learned those skills of picking apart why I do things and how can I get through life better in a more earnest and kind and forgiving way than I had been. And yeah, I interestingly, I mean, you talked about faith and that sort of thing. I don't come from a particularly religious background. My family was fairly non-religious, which was unusual back in the 70s in the South in Texas. And so I didn't really have that background. But I even today I consider myself fairly agnostic. But there's not a day that goes by that I don't fall back on the advice of the Serenity Prayer, which I
Mm-hmm.
didn't learn until I got into AA. What wonderful advice! I sort of came to that same conclusion through the Stoic philosophers, but they're teaching the same universal truth, which is exactly what you said. If there's something that I'm really stressed about and having a problem with, if I can ask myself, do I have any control over the outcome of this? And if the answer is no, I need to work on forgetting it. My worrying isn't solving any problems. It's just making me suffer when I can't do anything about it. And that's a hard thing to do and
Yeah.
takes daily vigilance, but you're absolutely correct.
And the other part of it is, even if the answer is no, introspection helps you then think about, well, why have I been worrying about it then? I mean, maybe there is
Exactly.
something else that's pertinent that made you start to worry about it. And
100%.
and it might very well be that you'll discover there is something about which you do have some control regarding whatever it is. But if you
Mhm.
don't take the time, and well, it's not just taking the time to be introspective, it's also making the life choice to say, I'm going to think about this and I'm going to find the solution that works for me and make that commitment. And that's got to be part of what you do, because it isn't just, oh, I'm going to think about this. Well, that's not enough. You also do have to decide, I'm going to deal with it. I'm going to find out what is going on, and then I can move forward, and I will move forward.
Absolutely. Yeah, how you deal with that powerlessness or inability to have any control is you're right, the next step. And it's difficult. There's so many things I have no control over. Actually, most things in the universe I am powerless to influence. I can't change the weather. I can't move the planets any differently. And so
Not yet, anyway.
not yet, no. But and same with situations. I mean, there's just some things that affect me that I don't really have the power to influence in any way. And so, yeah, how you deal with that and not let that fear, that worry, that angst control your life, which it has done before for I think a lot of us, is a challenge.
Well, what made you finally decide to start So Quiet and form an organization to deal with misophonia? I know you mentioned the pandemic, but what made
Hmm.
you start it? What happened?
That's a great question. At the time, I could sort of see that I just had a hunch that misophonia was probably not the rare condition that it was considered in, like, 6 or 7 years ago. It was thought to be a very rare disorder, or a rare thing to experience. And I had a hunch that that wasn't the case. And I also saw that there was a lot of advocacy and awareness and support that needed to happen based off of the input I was receiving from other people with misophonia that nobody was doing. There at the time was one other nonprofit organization dedicated to the misophonia world, and I just wasn't really happy with what they were doing, and what they were doing was not much. They weren't
Mm,
really doing anything from the viewpoint of lived experience. Nobody on their board had misophonia. They were all sort of veteran clinicians, and they weren't doing all of the things that came to my mind as what needed to be done to spread awareness and to further research and on and on. And so I thought, well, I guess it's up to me, as Bob Dylan says. Nobody else is doing it, so
right.
I have the opportunity to see if maybe it's something I can impact, and have been very fortunate to have some really notable, wonderful people sign on early to our board and to sign on to volunteer, and um, to help fund some of our programs, like our student research grants are something that we give out to graduate students who are interested in researching misophonia for a thesis project or a doctoral dissertation. We can give them some funding to undertake a small study, and we were fortunate enough to find some families who had a child with misophonia who wanted to fund that kind of research program. So we've been fortunate. We've done some very successful things. Not to pat myself on the back too much, because we've had a lot of help.
Hmm.
But we based on my experiences in the recovery community, I became a certified peer specialist, which is something that the state of Missouri certifies after some training. And we started the first peer support program, comprehensive peer support program for misophonia in the world. And so we're training people to be facilitators of peer support groups for misophonia, and just a lot of things that didn't exist that I thought would be nice to have happen, or other people told me that they would like to see as resources for people with misophonia. And so we just try to do the things that people say they want that don't exist.
Well, you got to start somewhere, needless to say, of course,
That's right.
and make it work. What's a really great success story that you can point to with So Quiet that's really made a difference?
Oh, that's a great question. We've got a kind of a weird mishmash of things that we do. We've sort of focused more on the research aspect of it, not only with our research grants, which have been, I think we've given out probably 10 of those in the last few years. Um, but we also have some other research and support-based things. We just launched, actually kind of relaunched a project that we took on a couple of years ago, where it's misophoniaproviders.com. It's a free website, an online directory of clinicians like psychologists or audiologists who know what misophonia is and know how to work with clients who have misophonia. And we're working on training for clinicians so that they can get up to speed on it. There aren't really any proven treatments yet for misophonia, but there are ways of working with people who have misophonia so that you can help them cope and get by, and maybe even test for other conditions that and weed those out. And so there's ways of doing that. So we launched a free online directory for such clinicians in the last month, and we're working on the training for that. And that's really filling a huge niche. We decided to focus on that because misophonia is not well known, and we just heard so many people contacting us saying, "I went to my doctor or I went to my counselor and said, 'Hey, I think I have this misophonia.'" And the counselor or doctor had no idea what it was. They'd
Mm.
never heard of it. They don't know how to work with it. They don't know what to do. And we heard that so much that we just realized that that is a huge bottleneck. If we take the prevalent studies I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, that 5% of the population roughly has misophonia to a moderate or advanced impacting what experience, like they have it in a way that impacts their life in some way. Either they're avoiding situations, or it's affecting their job or their schooling or their relationships. That's still millions of Americans. And if millions of Americans are experiencing this, even at 5%, and I can think of maybe 30 clinicians in the entire country that I would feel confident enough telling somebody to go to, That's a huge problem if only
Yeah.
30 people are handling millions of sufferers or people who experience it. So we want to try to tackle that and really make it so that we're training clinicians on misophonia. It is hard to understand. It's a strange thing for people to get their head wrapped around all of its idiosyncrasies. But I would like to say, hopefully, in a year, that there's at least one or two clinicians in every state of the U.S. that can see misophonic clients, because currently that's not the case. So
Yeah.
I think that seems to be going really well. It's a huge project, but it's really just to try to solve that problem that we hear so much about, and it is heartbreaking. If you talk to your trusted clinician about something and you know more about it than they do, that's kind of frustrating.
Well, one of the things that I'm sort of curious about in our modern world there where things continue to get better and so on, are we seeing yet any kind of advances medically speaking and scientifically speaking to help misophonia, or is it still too new?
That's a great question. Yeah, we've been really fortunate. About 4 years ago, there was a family in the Chicago area that has a daughter with misophonia, and they started what's called the Misophonia Research Fund. This is a private fund, family funded fund that has provided the money necessary for some very great studies. The number of studies on misophonia in the last, let's say, 3 to 4 years has really ramped up. Um, Researchers find it fascinating because it's so strange. Like misophonia doesn't really align with any known conditions or disorders that we understand better, like OCD or ADHD. Not that we understand those fully, but it's just it's an anomaly, and people want to learn about it because it's so strange. As far as from a medical standpoint, I mean, and fascinating. And so there's been a lot of research on it, and of course, people are struggling every day with it, and would really like to see some kind of treatment in the near future. So there's a number of universities and labs around the world who have been studying this diligently, like at Duke, Baylor, Oxford University has some going on, among others. And yeah, they're coming at this from a variety of aspects. Some of the more recent work from Duke and from Oxford aren't really, let's say, aren't really treating misophonia itself, but are working on using known practices to help cope with it better. So things like cognitive behavioral therapy, which is a well-established psychological practice, which covers a lot of different methods, has been shown to be fairly effective at helping people cope better and handle those triggering situations better in life. So there's some of that. Now, we have some studies on the brain activity of people with misophonia, and there's about 3 or 4 of them that show that the way a person's brain responds with misophonia is different than how somebody who doesn't have it would respond to the same sounds. And so researchers are looking at those different brain areas that are activated in somebody with misophonia when they hear a particular sound, and seeing if there's anything that we know of that can affect that. So long story short, there's a few studies happening now on using existing medications that are on the market to maybe treat misophonia. We don't have the results of those. They may not prove to be successful at all, but there's one in New York at Mount Sinai testing a very well-established medication called propranolol. That's a beta blocker that's been around for years. It's very affordable. There's some speculation that that might help affect the parts of the brain that misophonia uses. And again, I feel like maybe I had too much coffee. I feel like I'm being long-winded, so I apologize. But
No.
as a third part of that, we're also seeing some interest on the technological front for assistive devices. One of the things that I think is really fascinating that has just started is there's a lab, I think it's an academic lab in Washington State, that developed an AI algorithm that is a context-aware noise canceling algorithm.
I was wondering about that.
Yeah. So a lot of people with misophonia now use off the shelf noise canceling headphones, and
Right.
noise canceling headphones aren't smart. They just knock out a
No.
particular frequency
Right.
and that's it. This is a whole different ball game. And I the people who have seen the prototypes of it call it miraculous for misophonia. And the AI wasn't even developed for misophonia. It was developed for audio editing, a completely different use. But if you train this particular noise canceling AI on a type of sound, it learns what that type of sound is, and it can completely remove that sound in a noise canceling function, but not affect any other sounds. So, for example, if somebody with misophonia was triggered by birds singing, that's not a real common one, but I'll use that as an
Well,
example.
it's a great example, though.
Yeah, you can train it with the types of bird noises that a particular person finds aversive, and the AI learns what those are. And within the context of its input, can just completely remove those sounds, not based on frequency, but the actual sound
With the
itself,
actual sound, yeah.
and not
And
affect voices, not affect any other ambient noises at all. And if it works as people say, that's going to be a wonderful assistive device for people with
yeah,
misophonia. It could be life changing.
that'll be a major game changer because that deals
Yeah,
with the basic sound. So
absolutely.
then you could be in a classroom and not worry about the kids chewing gum.
Precisely. Yep. Be cool. So
I
there's a lot of work on it, a lot of interest in treatments and stuff.
yeah. Well, and that's why I asked. It just seems like it would make sense, and I'm glad there's enough of an awareness about it now that
Mhm.
people are in fact um, doing more research regarding it. So
Yeah,
I'm assuming that misophonia would be considered a disability.
absolutely. Yeah, one of the things that we started off that was a big important part of So Quiet's early days that nobody was really tackling was that misophonia can be a disability. It affected my life. It still affects my life every day in all kinds of ways, which I can go into. But not for everybody. Some people have symptoms of it, and it's
Mhm.
not affecting their life. They're not avoiding things, or it's not impacting their relationships or their life activities. But when I looked at the say the ADA definition of what a disability is, it's pretty broad, and I say what you will about the ADA, it's got plenty of things to criticize, but I think the definition that it uses to determine what is a disability is pretty open.
Yeah.
Um, and so I appreciate that. And my experience with misophonia absolutely fits that. Misophonia has affected my social life, my schooling, my work. I've quit jobs because of my misophonia. When I look back, there's been a couple of jobs that I just walked out of because something was so disturbing to me and my sensory aversion that I've actually left jobs, which I'm not encouraging anybody to do that, but it's impacted my life a lot.
But
Um,
you know a lot more now too.
I do, yeah.
And so that I would think can help make it more possible for you not to quit a job or that you can change the circumstances so you can perform a job.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. It's very validating to even have the most basic of affirming information. So the fact that it was given a name, this amorphous thing that was hard to explain and hard to describe, now has a name. I can tell people, Google misophonia, and that will explain things very well. We have a consensus definition. A bunch of researchers about 3 years ago published in an academic journal sort of a consensus definition on what we mean when we say misophonia, what this thing is as we understand it. So that helps. Probably one of our most low tech but popular programs or initiatives with So Quiet is our free information cards. And these are just business cards, really. They're double-sided business cards that say, I have misophonia. Here's a brief description of what it is. You're not doing anything wrong, but that sound is going to be very disturbing to me while I'm around. Would you mind not doing that? Again,
Yeah.
thank you for your help. And we printed those because a misophonic reaction is so physiologically uncomfortable. A lot of people feel very irate or frustrated or uncomfortable, or it's impossible to communicate about it in a way that's kind and helpful when you're having that reaction. And so the cards we send for free to people all over the world. We've sent out thousands and thousands of these. The cards do the talking for you when you can't, and you can hand them out to people and help them learn about it. And those have been incredibly popular. But just having tools like that, I use the cards sometimes if I'm talking to somebody new about it, a stranger or somebody that I've never met at a meeting or whatever. I can say, hey, when you get home, you can look up more about this particular thing, but here's what it's called. This is what I experience. And that's why I have the no chewing gum rule at this meeting.
Yeah.
But the cards are low tech, they're cheap, but hugely popular. We love sending them out. We sent them to every continent except Antarctica. And just it's been very helpful in communicating about this.
Well, you'll really have arrived when you get to Antarctica then.
We've reached out to people in Antarctica to see if they know anyone with misophonia. So we're working on that.
Yeah, it's a low population continent, but still.
Right.
But it is still definitely an issue that needs to be addressed in so many ways. And it's so exciting that you're doing it. And I go back to the thing that you said earlier about the AI solution. We keep hearing about AI and all the horrible things about it, but the reality is it is like anything else. It's how we use it. And I think that's a
Right.
very intriguing process that you're using AI to deal with sound. Somebody once told me about um, the whole issue with noise canceling, and it was some time ago, so it's evolved a lot. But they actually had a house, and they had noise canceling processes around the house. So even in the city, you didn't hear all the city sounds
Hmm.
until you got outside and away from the noise canceling. And now, of course, it's a whole lot different because you can do so much more about what you want to filter out.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And even very low tech solutions. I realized early on, and looking back, again, I can put the pieces together, but I like having a little bit of white noise around. So I have box fans around the house, and
Yeah.
I leave the exhaust fan in the bathroom and the kitchen on because it helps muffle things. And um, that little bit of white noise I find very helpful in a low tech way
How
of
about
coping
how
with it.
about ocean sounds?
I actually like ocean sounds. Now,
Yeah,
the
that's
interesting thing about misophonia is that every person with misophonia has kind of a different involuntary set of sounds that
right.
affect them. There's some ones that are fairly common, like eating sounds or soup slurping or whatever, are very common, but not everybody with misophonia is triggered by those. And so I actually love the sound of ocean waves,
Yeah.
cats purring. I find those very relaxing, but not everybody does. Some people hate white noise. I whatever.
I like silence, and so I
Yeah,
like the sound of the ocean and so on, but I also enjoy just sometimes not having anything on. And
yeah.
that's just me. But I believe when you're going back to being introspective, when you're really thinking and looking at things internally, it's nice to just be quiet and not have other things that distract you, because then you can really focus on what you need to do and listen to your own inner voice that you might not hear otherwise.
Mm, absolutely. And one of the things that's kind of hard to understand about misophonia is that complete silence is not always preferable. If you're in a
Hmm.
completely quiet room, then every little noise is more noticeable, and that can be our problem. So we
Sure.
often joke about there's sort of a middle ground of noise. If we go to a restaurant, finding where the optimal place to sit in a restaurant where you're not likely to be have your misophonia activated is sort of a mathematical challenge. But a medium busy restaurant is ideal. If it's too quiet, then you can hear everybody eating. If it's too noisy, it's overwhelming. There's kind of a general we look for medium busy restaurants as the ideal because the noise and chatter is just vague enough to cover up sounds and not be, I don't know.
I don't
It's
know.
kind of funny.
Today, I don't seem to have any luck at finding very quiet restaurants anymore.
Right. That's true. But it's as everybody who probably listens to your program knows, it takes a lot of just reconfiguring
Sure,
plans
it
all the
does.
time. It's a lot of improvising on the fly to suit our needs, and it's very common for me to go grocery shopping. And then if there's somebody popping their gum that you can hear all over the store, I have to leave and I'll just have to come back later and finish my grocery shopping. And it's just constantly rerouting and reorchestrating what I have planned to fit around the world and the input that it provides is it's kind of a challenge.
I guess I'm weird. I've never really learned to pop gum. I can chew it. I've never been a major gum chewer, but I've never really learned to pop it. So I don't make noise like other people did. And in fact, in reality, I didn't learn to blow bubbles with bubble gum until, gosh, it must have been like about 2004, well,
Wow.
2005 or 2006. I just never learned, but I finally did learn, and that's fine.
Interesting. Yeah, sometimes like I'll run into people in public and I wonder if they have misophonia, whether they realize it or not. This is a strange anecdote, but when my wife were moving from we were moving from Denver to St. Louis, and we stopped at a Denny's in the middle of Kansas somewhere, and we sat next to this older gentleman who was sitting by himself, and he didn't make any noise when he
Mm,
ate. The silverware never touched the plate. He chewed quietly. He didn't make a single noise. And we both noticed that. And we thought, I wonder if he has misophonia and he's accommodating for himself, whether he realizes that there's a word for it and it's a thing. Like he's being very
yeah.
conscientiously trying not to make any noise when he's eating. It's
Yeah, for
fascinating.
for me, I just never learned it. I mean, so I don't think it was an avoidance issue. I just never learned how to do it. And as I say, I finally learned how to blow bubble gum because somebody
Yeah.
finally described the process in a way that I was able to emulate it and
Hmm.
blow bubbles. But no
Yeah.
one had ever described it to me. And so having not seen other people do it and see how they do it, it was fun. I'm glad I can now blow bubbles, but
Yeah, that's a skill. One other thing that's interesting that you kind of reminded me of is when we have conditions or disorders like misophonia or misokinesia or other sensory aversion or sensory sensitivities, we can oftentimes end up in kind of a accommodations stalemate where
mhm,
we have conflicting needs. So a lot of people who have, say, anxiety disorders or PTSD or anxiety, and a lot of times people with autism, they like to make noises
mhm,
and do what they call stimming, which is kind of
right.
self-soothing,
Yeah.
repetitive movements. Popping bubble wrap is very soothing to them, but for somebody with misophonia, like those are the things that we want to
Want
avoid.
to
And so
avoid, right?
sometimes what might make one person comfortable and that they need to be doing for their own serenity is going to be very aversive to people with sensory disorders. And
Yeah.
so in a classroom or a work environment, sometimes we get these conflicts of needs. It's tough to navigate.
Yeah. How do you deal with that? I mean, I guess you have the cards that you mentioned, but
Hmm.
in general, I guess that's kind of the sort of thing that you have to do is to recognize you have to deal with people who
Yeah.
aren't necessarily sensitive to what you're wanting to deal with.
Yeah, in some of those instances, one of the things we do a lot is writing advocacy letters from a lived experience standpoint on what
Yeah.
misophonia is to help people get accommodations if they need them. And they're usually very simple, uh, no cost or low cost things that people can ask for at their work or in their school. But a lot of times, that gives us an impetus to ask for either remote learning, maybe
Mm-hmm.
for somebody with misophonia. That's a lot more common now. Having a private workspace that's not necessarily an office, but is quieter, and that way both people can have what they need, and
Yeah.
and we try to come up with creative solutions to help everybody with accommodations.
What would you tell someone today that you encounter who kind of feels helpless and hopeless because they have a condition like misophonia?
That's a great question. I think one of the big reasons I started a nonprofit was strictly to help with that. People with misophonia, or really, any kind of similar condition or disorder, can kind of start feeling hopeless. Misophonia can be very isolating. Like I said, people avoid interacting with the public or their families or the world at large as a way of coping. And it can seem like the world in its current state is not made for people like us. The world is a noisy place.
Yeah.
We're in a society. And so it can start you can kind of get down in a hopelessness pit, as I call it, kind of a depression hole, thinking, well, am I cut out for the world? What kind of job am I going to have? I have to work with other people. I have to go to school with other people. I actually like talking to other people. I just can't.
Mm-hmm.
I sort of compare it sometimes to an allergy. So a person with, say, a peanut allergy might actually like peanuts. They just can't have them.
You just can't have
And
them.
so I try to tell people that all hope is not lost, even though we don't have a proven treatment yet. We should in the future. Things are getting better. We have a lot of things now that we didn't have when I was growing up, as far as information and support and a community that all understands this. And those things can be wonderful. We have peer support meetings, and just to hear somebody say, I've never met another person before today who had misophonia, and knowing that this thing that I have had such a hard time explaining to my family, that you all get it. You all know what
Yeah.
it's like, and when nobody else in my life truly gets it. That's amazing. All hope is not lost, and one day at a time, we can kind of get through. And it's a challenge, as it is with any disability, to get through hour by hour. But over time, I feel like my life is going well, even with my invisible disabilities or invisible disorders.
Right.
Just takes a little extra work, a little more creativity, a little more understanding from other people, so on and so forth.
But you synthesize that and you understand it, which is
Mhm.
important. So you've had that blessing, and I'm glad that you're able to pass that on to other people.
Yeah.
Being curious and nosy, as I mentioned earlier, we got introduced through Sheldon. How did you guys meet?
That's a great question. I was, for a completely unrelated reason, I was looking at business websites. I, for our website, our So Quiet website, I wanted to put together terms and conditions. Now, geeky people know that pretty much any website you visit for a business or organization, there's some page on their website that is the terms and conditions for using their
Yeah.
website. Most people don't venture into those because they're just legalese,
Yeah.
but they exist. So I was
But
looking
they
at some
exist.
examples. What's that?
But they exist.
They exist, yeah, for legal aficionados. But
Yeah.
I was looking. I think if I remember correctly, and don't quote me on this, I think it was the Dr. Bronner's soap page had this little accessibility button in the lower right corner of every page of their site,
Mm.
and I was like thinking, what is that? So I clicked on it, and it brought up this really cool, robust menu of accessibility
Right.
options for visual impairments, ADHD, helping you focus on things, and just any kind of thing you can imagine, as far as ways that you can change a website to make it more accessible was on there. And that blew my mind. And of course, running a nonprofit with a very popular website that's based around
Mhm.
particularly sensory disabilities, I had to reach out, and I found out that it was the accessiBe plugin. It's very easy to install on our website, and so I reached out, and they put me in touch with Sheldon, who helped us get on board and add it to our website, and has been really very helpful and a good advocate for people like us.
And it's been working for you?
Yeah, yeah,
Oh,
I'm really delighted to have that on our website and be able to offer that to everybody who visits us.
well, that's cool. I'm glad that it's working well, and that it's helping
Hmm.
people be able to interact more with the site. And you're right, it's got a lot of different profiles. And the neat thing about accessiBe is it continues to grow and expand, and it's
Yeah.
so much more than it used to be. And it will continue to do that, which is another example of AI. It's not going to do
Hmm.
everything as perfectly as one would like, but there are other alternatives that accessiBe has for websites that are more complex. But still, the fact that you're able to make it work and it's enhancing your website, that's as good as it gets.
Yeah, and I think if I remember correctly, again, I'm kind of new to accessiBe, but I think part of the AI is that it generates image descriptions
It can.
kind of magically, which blows my mind.
Some are more accurate than others. Like
Maybe
on my,
so.
well, but that's okay. But you know what? They're getting better all the time. That's the real issue. Um, and so images that may not be described with the AI technology and described well today might very well be much more accurately described in 6 months. That's the neat thing about accessiBe. It is so scalable.
It
And
is.
it
And
and it makes it possible when any improvements are made to accessiBe, it improves every site that uses accessiBe, which is so
automatically.
cool. Yeah.
Yeah. And while we were talking, I think I'll reach out to Sheldon because I just had an idea for a feature that I don't think is on there that I could recommend. And that is white noise and brown noise as an
Mm.
option, a little player. We added a brown noise player to our website, but if that was a part of the accessiBe options to have kind of a white noise or I think I'll
Give it a
recommend
shot.
that to Sheldon. We'll see what
That
happens.
makes sense. See what happens.
Yeah.
Well, if people, speaking of reaching out, want to reach out to you and learn more about So Quiet and so on, how do they do that?
That's a great question. You can visit our website. It's just soquiet.org. You can find us on pretty much every social media platform. We have the same handle for everyone. It's soquiet.org. Or you can email me at hello@soquiet.org.
There you go. Well,
It's
I
that
hope
easy.
people will reach out. It is easy.
Likewise.
And I think that's so cool. Well, I want to thank you for being here. This has been very informative and a lot of fun. And I've learned a lot. I love to say that if I'm not learning at least as much as anybody else who listens to the podcast, I'm not doing my job right. So
Yeah,
I really enjoyed learning and really valued the time that we got to spend. So you
same
are always
here.
welcome to come back any old time you want if you've got other things to chat about. Have you written any books yet?
No.
Get to work. Get to work. Come on.
I'm thinking about that. You know, there's actually only been one book on misophonia published by a major publisher. In other words, that wasn't self-published, and that
Right.
came out last year by Dr. Jane Gregory. She's a great collaborator of ours. But maybe I will write a book. But I'll tell you, Michael, it's been wonderful. I thank you so much for having me on your podcast and for doing what you do. It's been a delight to learn your story as well and learn about your experiences and we talked a little bit about philosophy and self reflection, and it's just been wonderful being on here. So thank you so much.
Well, this has been fun, and I hope that all of you listening out there have enjoyed this. I'd love to hear from you. Love to hear your thoughts. Love to hear what you liked, maybe what you didn't, but I hope you liked it all. You can reach me easily enough. It's Michael, Michaelhi, at accessiBe, accessibe.com, or go to our podcast page, which is www.michaelhingson.com/podcast. And Michael Hingson is spelled michaelhingson.com/podcast. And wherever you're watching or listening, please give us a 5-star rating. We love getting ratings and we appreciate the high ratings that you give us and any input that you have. And Cris, for you and anyone out there who is encountering the podcast, if you know of anyone else who ought to be a guest, please let me know. We are always looking for more people to come on Unstoppable Mindset that we get to chat with, that we can all learn from. So please do that. And we really value all your input and all the things that you have to say. So again, Cris, I want to thank you. This has been a lot of fun.
Thanks, Michael. Hope you have a great rest of your week, and I look forward to doing this again sometime in the future.